When we think of Argentina, we think of tango, Lionel Messi, of Buenos Aires, we think of Maradona, of Mafe, of the blue and white flags, but we almost never think of black people, and that's not for nothing. Today, less than 1% of Argentines declare themselves as Afro descendants. In the streets of Buenos Aires, as in history textbooks or on television sets, black faces are almost absent, as if this population has never existed, as if it had never mattered. And yet, there was a time when black people represented 1/3 of the total population of Buenos Aires. They fought in the army, worked in the ports. In short, they played a central role in the economic and cultural life of the country. So, what happened? Why this disappearance? How could a population so present become suddenly invisible? Today, we are going to talk about an erasure, not a sudden, brutal, spectacular erasure, but a slow, methodical, silent one. We are going to talk about the black people of Argentina and about how the entire country tried to erase their memory. In the 17th and 18th century, Argentina was part of the Spanish colonial empire, and as in every colonial empire, there were slaves. Tens of thousands of Africans were forcibly deported from Angola, Benin, or Senegal to be sold on the docks of Buenos Aires. At that time, the city was nothing like the cultural center that it has become. It was a trading post, a crossroads where contraband, cattle, leather, and human beings intersected. Contrary to what people believe, Argentina was not spared from the slave trade. It was simply less documented, and yet the numbers are there. At the beginning of the 19th century, 1 on 3 of the inhabitants of Buenos Aires was either black or mixed race. Afro-descendant women cooked, washed, raised the children of white families. Then men were often sent to the army or to plantations in the northeast. But black people were not just labor force. They formed a true community with their traditions, their languages, their rituals, their music. They had their church, their religious brotherhoods, their own festivals, and this presence really affected Argentina's culture. In other words, black people were not a footnote in Argentine history. They were a full chapter. But this chapter, barely written, was going to be erased. In the 19th century, Argentina entered a new era. They fought for their independence. They built their army. They traced the boundaries of their nation. But this construction was not for everyone. On the contrary, it was done at the expense of some. And the first to pay the price was the black population. From the first war of independence, black men were massively enlisted. They were promised freedom in exchange of their blood. But what they were not told is that they would often be sent to the front lines without weapons, without training, and it did not stop there. A few decades later came the war against Paraguay, known as the War of the Triple Alliance, a brutal, bloody conflict fought from 1865 to 1870, and again, the Afro-descendant battalion were the most exposed. The mortality rate was terrifying, to the point that at the end of the 19th century, observers were already noting that black people had almost disappeared from Buenos Aires. But that was only the first step. In 1871, a yellow fever epidemic struck Buenos Aires. It hit above all the poorest, most densely populated neighborhoods. And of course, those were mostly inhabited by black people, descendants of slaves. Crowded together, without access to healthcare, excluded from circles of power, thousands died. Their share of the population collapsed further. And this time, it was not war, but disease that decimated them. But what must be understood is that this disappearance was not just a coincidence. It was part of an ideology, that of a modern European white Argentina. From the end of the 19th century, the country opened its doors wide to millions of immigrants from Italy, Spain, Germany, or Switzerland. They were encouraged, valued, settled in the cities. And in parallel, black people were quietly erased from the landscape. In 1887, the category called Negro were officially erased from the censuses. The last Afro Argentines recorded were drowned in vague categories: mulattoes, mestizos, whites. So if a population doesn't appear in statistics, then it doesn't exist, right? Argentina built an image of itself, that of a country without the African African past, turned towards Europe that saw itself as whiter than Brazil, more civilized than its neighbors. And this image is cultivated for more than a century. When a population disappears physically, one might think its memories remains, but in Argentina, it was the total opposite. After wars, epidemics, and falsified censuses, it was black culture itself that was targeted for erasure. No more Afro schools, no more religious brotherhoods, no more public representations. Black peoples were no more in newspapers, nor on stage, nor in history books, and yet were everywhere. Tango, its rhythms came from candomblé, from African percussions played by free slaves in the working class neighborhoods of Buenos Aires. But this link was never mentioned. It was not taught in school. It was preferred to say that tango came from European immigrants in the suburbs, erasing the black people who also lived there. And it was not only in music. Even toponymy, the names of streets, of neighborhoods, carried clues. The neighborhood of San Telmo, one of the oldest in Buenos Aires, was once a center of Afro life. The word Quilombo today used to mean disorder originally came from communities of runaway slaves. But who remembers that? It was not an accidental forgetting. It was a murdered memory, buried as if recognizing this past threatened the image Argentina wanted to project of itself. And yet some remembered. Entire families continued to transmit in silence, dances, words, receipts. Descendants of Afro Argentines kept in drawers photos, archives, stories that no one ever came to ask them about. For decades, Afro Argentines' story was relegated to the margin, invisible in books, ignored by the media, minimized by politicians. But today, things are beginning to change. In 2010, for the first time in more than a century, the Argentine census asked a simple question: do you consider yourself Afro-descendant? Tens of thousands of people said yes, some out of pride, others out of family memories, still others out of the desire to repair a forgetting. It was the beginning of a late but important recognition. Afro-descendant communities organized, regrouped, demonstrated, and created associations. They demanded that their history be taught and their figures be celebrated, that injustice be repaired. Artists, researchers, activists spoke out. They told their roots, their pride, their wounds too. They reminded that Black Argentina is not only an ancient story, it is alive, here and now. And that's not all. Since the 1990s, new waves of migration from West Africa, mainly from Senegal, have brought visibility back to black faces in big cities like Buenos Aires, Rosario, or La Plata. But again, it's not simple. These communities face racism, rejection, precariousness. The gaze of white Argentina on its Afro descendants remain often dirty with exotism, mistrust, or ignorance. And yet, step after step, things are shifting. Schools are integrating Afro history into their programs. Museums are beginning to organize exhibitions, and young people proudly identify as Afro Argentine because claiming this history is more than a question of identity. It is a way of saying we are here, we deserve to be seen. Thank you to have watched the video until the end, and tell me, what do you think about this story? It was touching. I carry you. Ciao.